Sure, and welcome to the programme. I can see you all filing in. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, based here in New Zealand. My name's Ian Kaplan, and a very warm welcome to our conversation this month, a conversation about the profession of regulation. Now, GREG is hosted in New Zealand by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And so I start, as I always do, with the opening karakia, and I do so now. Tawhia tomana kia mau, kia maia kahuri, takuaro, ki te pai kahurangi, he reira, te oranga moku. Mamahitahi ka ora, ka puawai. Amato, mahi katoa, ka pono, ka tika, tihe moriora. Well, welcome members of the audience. And now that we're together, these are conversations that, as always, are there to assist you in the conversations that you may well be having, or perhaps even indeed to provoke conversations of a similar kind. And as the Zoom invitation, which you signed off on, as it were, reminds us, and I do again, these are live recorded and in public. That means you could be watching us live. It could be that you're watching us recorded. It could mean that you're watching us in New Zealand or indeed anywhere else on the planet. You may well be through one of our perhaps sister communities of practice or other groups that are associated with the business of regulation. It always remains the case of these webinars that wherever and whenever you're watching us from, you're most welcome here. Today's conversation, as I say, for this hour is about the profession of regulation. It's been almost, and we're allowed to take this trip down memory lane, members of the audience, almost a decade since the Productivity Commission said that New Zealand's regulatory workforce, and I look at my paraphrase quote, should be viewed as a profession just like lawyers, accountants, nurses, and engineers. The Commission didn't waste its words, and I quote directly, even those who work in the regulatory compliance sector do not necessarily appreciate that they are part of a community, a sizable 12,000 plus member community of professionals. But what exactly does that mean? What exactly does the profession of regulation mean? Might we ask ourselves, are we there yet? And practically speaking, does it actually make any difference whether we're there yet or not? That's something that perhaps you members of the audience will have some observations on. We got a poll coming up here. 2 questions for coffee. The first question, and it's coming up now, both of them I think will be simultaneous. Our pollsters behind the scenes will be getting them to you. The first question is, do you see yourself as a regulator? Do you see yourself as a regulator? If you get through the gateway of 1 and your answer is yes, then do you see yourself as belonging to a profession of regulators? We've had some interesting backstage chats as to this, because we are very interested to see what you say. Off you go, members of the audience. Let's have a look. Thank you, members of the audience. 90% of you think they're regulators, 5% don't, 5% are not sure as matters stand. And then if you see yourself as belonging, 56%, an interesting number there, belonging to a profession. That is an interesting point. I welcome our panelists now to talk to us today. Professor Jeroen van der Heijden, who is the chair in regulatory practice at Victoria University of Wellington. And he rejoins us because he was here a few episodes back. Welcome to him. Lisa Docherty, the director of GREG, who's my boss, so I'm on best behaviour. And Jess Carter, the manager, governance and executive at Civil Aviation Authority. And last but not least on our panel is Simon Thomas, the national manager, building system assurance at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Welcome one and all, kia ora. And let's just go to the questions. Jeroen, first of all, welcome to you. Your state-of-the-art article on the profession of regulation, it's 27 pages. Productivity Commission did 540 pages. I don't get out much. I weighed yours, and it's 5% of the paperweight of the Productivity Commission, but it packs a heck of a punch. You cover a lot there, particularly the history. How long have there been calls for the professionalisation of the public service?
Thanks, Ian. Look, if you sort of jump into history and try to understand when people began to call for a professional public service, you see in the Western world at least, sort of the first calls coming up by the end of the 19th century. So that's roughly 150 years ago. And what governments began to realize by then was that on the one hand, people's expectations about the public service had changed. What public administration meant had changed by that time. And governments began to realize that, yes, they had a lot of public servants working for them, but those were really specialists. They were medical doctors, they were engineers, they were city planners, but they were not professional public servants. They were not people who did understand what the running of government means. So the idea began to get introduced that perhaps we should train up people in the profession of a public service. What does it mean to be a general public servant? So roughly 150 years ago, we first saw these questions coming up, and we still see this around the world.
And I guess that was my next point. When you look around the world in your job as you do, professionalism in the narrow and the broad sense, what exactly, Jeroen, do you see?
Yeah, that's not a really good question. So the term professionalism or being a professional or professionalization is of course thrown around a lot. But you can look at it in a narrow and a broad sense, as you already said. So in a narrow sense, we tend to think about professionalism as having completed advanced and specific training, holding expertise, and all that sort of based on recognized credentials. So really, it's really about the individual. What is it that the individual knows? What is it that the individual has been trained in? In a much broader sense, being a professional or professionalization really means that you act proficiently, ethically, being competent in your job, striving for quality. And you could almost say that as a group, as a cohort, you could sort of argue that a professional group of regulators would have a comparable set of knowledge and follow what you could call a shared code of conduct about the quality of the services that they deliver. And that is something that we've seen happening all around the world over the last few decades. So training institutions have been introduced. The largest consultancy firms now focus on regulation. And of course, around the world, just like GREC, we've seen organizations popping up and developing in which regulators come together, individual regulators come together and try to increase the services that they are providing to the public at large. So we have GREC in New Zealand, the NRCOP in Australia. We know that in the UK we have a similar sister organization. So this is sort of happening all around the world.
So it's a worldwide movement. I guess in practice, Jess, if I can turn to you, good morning. What practical thoughts do you have where you've seen perhaps the benefits of a regulatory profession, or if you like a regulatory profession, maybe in waiting, depends where you come from on that point. In practice and in play, what benefits are there that you see?
Thanks, Ian. Well, I'm not sure that we're quite there yet in terms of having an established profession, but as Jeroen referred to, we've got the ingredients, so to speak, of establishing that regulatory profession. You know, things like GREG, you know, we've got the executive buy-in, certainly, with things like the regulatory chairs group. We've got established expectation around the likes of regulatory stewardship, and those are starting to provide benefits. You know, using CAA as an example, all staff employed at CAA, regardless of your role, complete the, you know, the level 3 core knowledge certificate through GREG. And that ensures that everyone has a base understanding of regulation. So that enables everyone, regardless of the work that they do, to at least put their work into a regulatory context and to create that common understanding and a shared language, not only internally, but I guess across agencies as well. And in a similar vein, the postgraduate certificate that Simon and I have been doing this year has allowed a group of professionals to come together and to sink their teeth into challenges that I think we're all grappling with as regulators. I mean, from my perspective, it's certainly easy to think of many practical benefits that we would get from having a really established profession. You know, having access to a more defined talent pool, efficiencies in recruiting, increased information sharing, you know, a central pool of guiding material and resources. I think it's really easy to list off those benefits.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We'll come to the teeth sinking point a little later on the certificate. Thank you for that. Just to you, Simon, what benefits have you seen or not, as the case may be?
Thanks, Ian. Kia ora, everybody. So a bit similar to Jess, I guess, you know, in the fact that we have these, you know, the events that GREG has puts on these days and has been on for some time. It has been a really good step towards the profession being able to come together and discuss issues that are specific to, you know, the profession of being a regulator. I do still think, though, there's a bit of an identity crisis out there, though. You know, I think I was thinking about this the other day, and for some reason the census popped into my head, and I thought, well, when people are filling out the census and they're and I'll use myself as an example. I work at MB. So I'm a public servant, I'm a regulator, I'm also a trained lawyer. So when it gets to the occupation bit, what do I write down?
Yeah,
and I think when I last did one, I actually wrote down public servant, because I guess that from a statistical perspective, that's probably how the world sees me first and foremost, as a public servant. So I think for us as regulators looking out, we do need to figure out a little bit how we can identify as a regulator what those defining characteristics are, and then how to establish those across organisations.
Yeah, and it's an interesting identity point, Simon. Now, members of the audience, I know you're not shy, and in fact, over 90% of you have told me that you're regulators, and less than that, significantly actually on this poll, said you identify as a member of a profession. Keep the Q&As open fire on them right now, lodge them as comments, have a chat. As I say, I know you're not shy, keep them rolling, we'll pick them up. So Lisa, good morning to you. How long has there been this need from your perspective for a regulatory profession? I think twinned with that, a close conversation that's been going on in New Zealand even before the Productivity Commission reported.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you, Ian. Yes, I think it's important to acknowledge that the Productivity Commission was an important catalyst for GREG and for a number of other shifts in how we view regulation as part of the public sector. But people have been edging us towards that profession from before then. So some of you will know or have been part of the CCCP, which I'm going to probably mangle, the Core Compliance Capability Project, or Core and Common Compliance Capability Project, which kind of seeded into GREG. And I guess my position is that professions and GREG in particular are emergent and then evolve. So there's nothing static in a profession. They are always changing. And I guess I do sit a little bit with Jess, is that I think we're at an exciting point in being emergent as a profession. And that's partly, you know, why I was keen to take on this role with GREG, because I think we are ready to take that next step into professionalism. A couple of points that my panellists have raised I think are important and part of that journey. And one of those is that GREG did come out and is funded and supported by agencies. And that's really important for us. It's important for the agencies and important for outcomes. But as we move into being professionals, then we take our identity more from what it is that we do than who it is that we work for. And that's where I think we get to some of the gains that you can think about in workforce and transferability. That is, as a public sector, we have a pool of professional regulators. We can deploy them in several different types of contexts. And I think I'll just add on to that, because if I was in the audience, I would be thinking about this. To acknowledge that many of our regulators are technical specialists, and one of the challenges or issues that gets raised to me, and I expect to many of you, is that, well, actually, I'm a lawyer. I'm an engineer, I have a profession. And my response to that is always that you can be more than one. It's a dual citizenship arrangement. You don't have to give back one passport to get the other. And I think many of our regulators are professionals in 2 or more spaces.
It's an interesting one. Thank you, Lisa. And I think it also brings in the point of dual citizenship and indeed identity. There are lawyers who know very much that there are lawyers, and in other jurisdictions, and my own one, the English bar, my former stomping ground, there are some pretty ornate traditions, the logic of which sometimes is interesting. As well as studying for 5 years, you have to eat, I think, 18 or 24 dinners, not on the trot, at one of the Inns of Court in London. But whether or not you get indigestion as a result, you know that you're an English barrister because there's all the trappings and the kind of the symbolism or the identity tags. And yet there are regulators who belong to an equally valid profession. But as I think we've been hearing, and what do you think, members of the audience? It's still emerging. The Productivity Commission, again, in their report, called out what it saw as the potential benefits of professionalisation. They said it ranged from more consistency and quality in the delivery of regulatory services to higher public confidence in the regulatory system. So professions have hallmarks. What do you think is the hallmark of a regulatory profession, members of the audience? Why does it matter? Let's hear from you. As I say, I know you're not shy and I know you're watching us carefully, but while you're watching us carefully, let's just reflect a little more on the hallmarks. Jeroen, back to you. What would you say, particularly with the international lens and looking comparatively, what are the further hallmarks of a regulatory profession?
Oh, excellent question again. Well, I think Jess already touched on that idea of having a shared common language so that we at least know that if we communicate amongst each other, that we sort of use the same concepts, use the same ideas, that we know what we are talking about. So that, for instance, if a CAA regulator discusses a regulatory problem with an EPA regulator, that they know that they are talking, roughly along similar lines. I think another hallmark that you sort of see around the world is that people begin to understand that they don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. Sort of many problems that happen in one regulatory area happen in another regulatory area as well. And how can you learn from each other? And this is what I sort of really like about Lisa's comment, sort of that dual citizenship. Yes, you can be a topic expert again in environmental issues and environmental regulations, but it doesn't mean that you cannot learn from and use ideas from a completely different area of regulation. And I think this idea of having a regulatory profession in which people, on the one hand, get trained in the same sorts of knowledge and skills, use the same sorts of language and concepts and ideas, makes that we can sort of overcome our topic area, so that we can step out of our own topic areas and look at the larger picture. And I think that is a very important part of that profession of regulation.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, I just see it's in the chat already. There's a point made about Lisa's point about dual citizenship, and if many regulators recruit from the industries they regulate, there's a perception risk, particularly if it's a performance-based regulatory system. I guess it becomes less cross-pollination, more contamination. Lisa, do you agree with that point?
I think it's not agree or disagree. It's more that I think in your regulatory team, you probably want a bit of both. So if you're establishing a team of regulators working with a specific industry with, some specific technical expertise, you want to have that understanding. You want the person working in your regulatory, unit to know that they bring in this role, they bring their expertise through a regulatory lens, and that lens is really important to how they do their job. But you also want to, separate webinar here, Ian, but you also want to be careful. You're managing a regulatory function and working with sectors, as you kind of want to avoid that capture. So it's always working into a nice balance of who you've got, who knows enough, who can take that regulatory lens to the technical knowledge that they know. And we know that New Zealand is a small country, and we have regulators who, cross the border and go and work in the regulated sector. And, you know, that's a good thing too, because we're all working inside a regulatory system. And if we have an understanding of that whole space and all the roles in it, then that can work really effectively.
I can see thumbs going up there, and I've got the boss here. Cue for another webinar on capture. And I should say, members of the audience, you know, if there is anything that you fancy seeing as a sort of webinar topic, something that activates you, get in touch with us, because it is always very interesting to hear, and we do listen. I think some of these topics are very evergreen, like capture. And how does it work? I mean, I just noticed, and again, forgive me for looking at the chat, but it's actually a rich source as well. And it may be a proxy Q&A if you're too shy at this point to do a Q&A, but what if I've been out of the industry, Simon, for 20 years, but I want to tell people how to do it? That's less a capture point, that's more a credibility point, isn't it? How does being a member of a regulatory profession assist that point?
I think it's a really good point, and it's something that we grapple with, particularly in my team, often. One of the things that we do, and as a result, you know, we have people working in our team who have had experience working within building consent authorities. But you know, that exact, I guess, problem does arise. You know, they come and work here at the central regulator. They move away from that competency of processing building consents or carrying out inspections or whatever it might be, but are then expected to regulate to a degree those organisations who are carrying out that work. So it presents a couple of problems for us in that, you know, we do still need to recruit from that pool of people, which, you know, at the moment especially can be a little fraught, robbing Peter to pay Paul sort of scenario. But also, you know, you're then needing your people to maintain two levels of competency from a very technical perspective, from understanding the building system and how that works, but also in a very technical manner, but also, you know, understanding how to be a regulator and how to merge those two things together to be effective in their role. So I think it's a difficult path to walk at times.
It's an identity crisis, isn't it? And it's a tough gig. I mean, Jesse, I think it arcs back to your point when you're saying, are we there yet, effectively, in terms of the formation of a profession at all levels of people coming in from different organisations? I don't know, does that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. And, you know, when I think about the hallmarks of any profession, really going back to Simon's earlier point around what you put on the census, and the examples that you've given of, you know, the bar and lawyers, I think the kind of underlying current there is around pride.
Yes.
I think the focus on regulatory failure in recent years, and frankly, the negative connotations of the public around regulation has inhibited us as regulators to have a real sense of pride for the work that we do and the value that it adds. So I think a hallmark of a profession is as much as about, you know, the established ethics and development of standards, which are really important for people to be able to anchor to, but also it's, you know, how you represent yourself on the census. How do you describe what you do at a friend's barbecue? Because if you ask a lawyer or a teacher or a doctor what they do, that's the first thing that they'll tell you. They'll tell you, I'm a lawyer or I'm a teacher. And so I think that dual citizenship, having the regulator as, you know, your other passport, is something that can work in cooperation. Because that tension already exists there, right? And I don't think that we'll ever be able to completely mitigate that, and I'm not sure we would want to.
Yes, it's a very, very interesting one, actually. I mean, the idea of you know, the pride and the kind of the barbecue conversation, and actually what that socially underscores, the signals that it imports. And perhaps pride comes before a fall, but if regulatory failure is to fall and we're always fighting it as regulators, then it kind of makes pride a slightly differently qualified piece. And the other point, which Grant comes in, very good question, Grant, which comes first, understanding the system or how to be a regulator? I'm going to put that back to you, Jess, because I think it links in nicely. Which one does come first in your view?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure if there's a right answer for one comes first. But, you know, in terms of the question around the potential conflict of interest, or when you've got people that come from a very specialized field or industry, I think it's really important for people to understand that ultimately they're there to deliver regulatory outcomes, and their subject matter expertise is an enabler. It's not an outcome in and of itself. So understanding the system within which they're operating is really important. And I think also the recognition that, you know, the reality is that we don't just have one regulatory system. We have overlapping and intersecting systems. And that's where I think a regulatory profession would really help regulators navigate that, because it is complex.
Yes, Lisa, I can see you nodding at that point.
Oh yeah, just agree with Jess that that there's not one or the other of understanding how to be a regulator or the system. You need to know both, and I think the learning about it comes together. I just wanted to add to that in terms of the profession, the bit that's really important to me, and I think is reflected a little bit in some of the chat that I'm seeing, is that professionals are always learning and developing, and the important part is they learn from each other. So some of that things about systems and where they interconnect can be drawn out simply by bringing people together to share the knowledge and experience that they have. And I think that's a really important function of GREG, of just actually bringing together, sharing knowledge. And out of that sharing of knowledge, we can generate knowledge. And that's the way that the profession starts to evolve and develop its own professional knowledge base. So there's a little bit of an evolution that gets us to that space of agreed professional standards and agreed professional expertise. And we started that off with the qualification programs that we've been running, but that's really the starting point for it. And there's a lot more that we can add to that.
Absolutely. Jeroen, I think it's something also that you've seen internationally developing in different strands across the piece, and you point to it in your state-of-the-art paper on the evidence basis that Lisa points to. But what do you say?
I'm also keeping an eye on the chat as well in the meantime.
Yes, I'm slightly distracted by that. Keep rolling.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to see what's coming up, and I do indeed sort of see some people who are arguing that, you know, if you really want to make regulation a profession, or if you really want to create a profession of regulation, do we need entry and exit requirements? Yeah. So should we regulate the profession of regulation in itself, just like, you know, lawyers are regulated and architects are regulated and whatnot? Arguably, that could be something we aspire to in the future. You know, arguably, we want to have people who perhaps identify as regulators and come in with accepted credentials and are being audited every once in a while. But then there is, of course, the challenge of what other people are saying here as well, is that you cannot be a good regulator if you have no understanding of the topic area. So it is almost like two Venn diagrams. You know, you want people who are good regulators, who understand the profession of regulation, who understand what it means to be a good public servant, who know what it means to do good inspection and how regulation works and whatnot. And at the same time, you want people who understand the industry well. So really good regulators sort of, you know, sit in that overlapping area. That there again comes back to that dual identity that Lisa was talking about. So what are we seeing internationally? Well, again, just like here in New Zealand, what we are seeing internationally is a slow movement towards more training, more sharing of knowledge. I haven't seen any associations that have very strict entry or exit criteria. But interestingly, and this of course is always a bit of a tricky point to discuss in a public arena, if you look at private certifiers or private sector regulators, they very often have to meet entry criteria such as being trained, having so many years of experience, having professional indemnity insurance. So if we look at that area of the market, we actually see that there is a profession of regulation following those traditional, following that traditional understanding. I'm not sure if we are ready for having a same approach to a public sector group of regulators, if that makes sense.
Yes, so possibly we're not there yet, but we're getting there, and we're emerging with some force. Members of the audience, if you've just joined us, we're over half time now, and I can see a number of you have just probably joined us since we began. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, talking about the profession of regulation. And we've been talking about what it is, why it is, and we've also been saying, and let's just recap, if I can put it this boldly, it's not my usual style, but so what? If we do a round robin of that point, so what? Why do we care, in a nutshell, about the profession of regulation? Jess, let's kick off.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think this has been covered. There's a lot of benefits to establishing a set regulation, as we've seen with similar professions. You know, you've got a community of practice, you've got resources to align on. As Jeroen was saying, I mean, while we all regulate different things, we are broadly grappling with the same issues, and we're, you know, trying to use similar tools and levers to achieve regulatory outcomes. And so there's real benefits from being able to learn from others, and I think a profession really enables that.
And I guess if we flip it, Lisa, what if the so what is, so what if not? What if we don't have an emerging, as you put it, profession of regulation? What's, whether they paint the apocalypse, what are the downsides in the real world?
Well, you know, I'm going to take a Pollyanna view there, Ian. I think the emergence has emerged, and it's kind of hard to kill that. I think, you know, my position, because of my role, is that we've got this great foundation on which to do more. And I'm finding it fascinating to look at the chat and see this talk about, you know, standards, codes of conduct. That's really interesting, and that's how professions evolve. It's not because someone says you're going to have a code of conduct, it's because a group of people who are already doing the work say, actually, we need to have a code of conduct. So it comes from the profession itself. You know, the guilds that started all this were you know, self-formed. So these are really interesting signals coming in. I think I'm with Jeroen in that we're kind of not there yet. And we've got a really interesting kind of landscape to address, which is around, well, we're public servants. And I think someone in the chat's mentioned, you know, there is a public sector code of conduct that, you know, may or may not be consistently implemented and adhered to. So where do we see ourselves outside of that? Before you ask me, I don't have an answer to that question. No. But I think it's a really interesting one, and probably one to watch over the next few years, now that we're working under a new Public Sector Act, which puts us into a certain direction.
It is absolutely fascinating, and I'm distracted properly by the chat, as all my colleagues are on the panel. Keep them flying, members of the audience, because it is an emerging thing. It is a thing to watch. Simon, I'm going to come to you with the so what. I'm going to nuance it a bit, because one of our colleagues in the audience said there's a real world, if you like, on the street professionalism. It's not just being a subject matter expert. It's the sense of being not just a bonded professional, but having the professional manner. And how much of that, I know offline we've spoken, and you said, you know, that regulators are being asked to do so much more, perhaps, you know, directly. How does that weave into the so what question that I've asked your colleagues?
Right.
And it's Friday morning.
Just a simple one. I think, you know, to the second part of your question first about regulators being asked to do more. You know, I think, you know, for some time, and certainly recently in my experience, if something goes wrong out in the marketplace, you know, the government and the regulators within government are being turned to as a potential solution for that problem, regardless of whether there's any legal or jurisdictional basis to intervene in any way. It's well, you work in this area, you regulate this area. It's up to you to come up with a solution.
Yeah.
Work with us.
Yeah.
To develop that solution. You know, I will specifically refer to the plasterboard issues that have occurred this year. You know, that one could very much argue that's a market issue. You know?
Right.
However, the government was directly asked to intervene and to come up with a solution, and that coming up with that solution landed firmly in the laps of public servants and regulators to try and fix that problem.
It falls to someone.
Yeah, and that's traditionally not something that we would get involved in as a regulator. So then going back to why it's important to have that regulator profession in the background. There are skills that come along with that profession that are very useful, but more importantly, I think it's the collegiality and the relationship side of things which really then come into play. It makes it a lot easier to pull on other levers in other areas of either government or private sector to achieve those aims that you were trying to achieve. And I think that's a really underestimated side of having a profession, that collegiality and the relationships that bring with it.
And you've got, I'm going to nuance it a bit more, but it's still a so what to you, Jeroen, because you're seeing, I guess, all over the world, more articles being written on this, more colleges having courses on this. Dare I say, and over cue the postgraduate certificate in New Zealand, you may just want to tell us about. But right across the piece, you're seeing lots of, if you like, teaching business and learning business, and the stock in trade of all but a profession in name or professional but name. What do you say to that?
Yeah, absolutely, Ian. Look, if we sort of look back at the last 2, 3, maybe 4 decades, what has happened in the area of regulation, how many changes we have seen, sort of the move away from traditional command and control, where a regulator would tell the regulated parties, this is how you need to do something, and if you don't do it the way I want to, then I give you a fine or hit you on the head in a different kind of way. That sort of traditional thinking about regulation has really, really changed. And in the slipstream of that change, we've seen that researchers have begun to try to find out about good practice in regulation, what works, what doesn't. And that knowledge that has been created then needs to be disseminated. And a great way of dissemination of that knowledge is, of course, through training. So like you're saying, Ian, all around the world, we do see that universities and other institutions are now providing training in regulatory policy making, regulatory practice. And we're also doing that, of course, here in New Zealand. So you have asked me to pitch the postgraduate certificate in public management that we are providing at the Victoria University of Wellington, where we bring together a group of regulators, and Jess and Simon can tell you much more about it because they've been part of this year's cohort, but where we bring together a group of regulators for a year to go through various topics on regulation and regulatory practice. We're trying to lift the skills and knowledge of people who are working on a day-to-day basis as regulators.
Yeah, and that's the key thing, isn't it? Who are working on a day-to-day basis as regulators. Jess and Simon, how was it? How is it in that course? I think you're back next week. Want to tell us about it a bit?
Sure, I can go first. We're almost wrapped up. I mean, I found the course really valuable, and it's a little bit meta, I guess, given the topic, but it has enabled me to actually see myself as a regulatory professional and see my work through a regulatory lens. I mean, my agency is unambiguously a regulator, but my role is not on the front line, and I think it's easy for those who aren't in frontline operational or policy areas to not see that at the forefront of their mind, and it's a bit rote, I guess, to refer to the janitor at NASA who helps put astronauts on the moon, but it is true. And when I reflected on my role and my team's role through the course, realized that we actually have significant influence on regulatory outcomes through our engagement with our monitoring agency, through the board, through ministers, through our quality and audit functions, which are really important for ensuring regulatory outcomes. So I found it very valuable to think about that work explicitly through regulatory frameworks.
Yes.
And I think also, in addition to, as we've talked about, providing the language and framework and tools to be able to engage with regulatory challenges, it's that collegiality that Simon was talking about. So the course has given us a direct access to a community of professionals who all come from, you know, really diverse backgrounds and diverse agencies. And I think that's, you know, invaluable.
And I think the key point is something in common. And just pick up Nick's comment in the chat here. We often think about regulators, frontline staff, true, but what does profession mean at leadership level? I think, Jess, you've just given an answer to that. And the implications for professional standards and the capabilities that we should see there. Lisa, I'll come to you in just a moment on that, because I'm sure you'll have a view on that. Simon, just to you in terms of your experience on the course, and obviously teachers watching.
Yeah, that's been hugely valuable. I think, like a lot of people, you sort of tend to fall into being a regulator.
Yeah.
Certainly how I entered the regulatory profession. So, and along the way, you know, you learn bits and pieces here and there. You do short courses or whatever it might be, professional development, to understand a little bit more why we regulate, how we regulate, the different approaches to regulation. But for me, one of the really valuable things has been sort of bringing together that theory of regulation and understanding why we do things the way we do now, particularly in the context of public management. I think that's been an interesting lens to look at it through, because you know, it sort of has showed there's more to it than just regulatory postures.
I'll just go back to Lisa, if I may, because this was Nick's point as well, which we all sort of pivoted off. And again, Lisa, sort of praying in age your more general additional experience across many professions. What are the implications for professional standards, and what sorts of capabilities should we see there? And I do look at Nick's item in the chat. What does the regulatory profession mean at the leadership level from the perspective you have?
Well, I'm just having a look at the chat now, and I think that idea of the leadership level is really critical to the idea of a profession. So a profession provides a full pathway and ranges of ways for people to move about within a profession, and leadership is really critical. You know, I've sort of reflected on it in terms of, so this year at the moment we're conducting an evaluation of GREG from 2015 to 2022, and to think back on what have we achieved and where might we put our focus next. And I think we've done a good job of bringing in those regulatory practice qualification programs for frontline staff. Obviously, we still want to keep evolving and improving those. But I think a focus on leadership is probably a good place to go, because that's where our leaders are the ones who have the best view of the capability on the ground and where the needs are. And for GREG in particular, it's had, and we're very fortunate to have had the buy-in of 14 chief executives. So we've got this level, we're coming up to 10,000 learners through our level 3 to 6 courses, but there is a big chunk in the middle of people moving through roles into leadership positions, and in some ways, by establishing ourselves as a profession, we're actually growing people into leadership roles with those kind of values and standards that we want to see. And to the point of whether we bring them in mandatorily, in an evolutionary sense, they should just be emerging anyway. So we would be at a stage of having some sort of agreed expectations.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it really triggers, I think, the market calls that Simon's pointing to, and also the if you like, the profession's own calls, or the people in the nascent profession calling for this sort of organisation. And I'm just triggering the conversation in turn that you members of the audience have been having through the chat about potentially emblemising that in an oath, or something that kind of makes it clear that you are a regulator as distinct from any other profession. I'm going to be devil's advocate here in this question to the panel, and members of the audience, you jump in as well. Isn't there a danger that a regulatory profession being could be taken to be one size fits all, and so therefore meaningless because of the plethora of the different things that we regulate? What does anyone say to that?
while everyone's thinking about it, Ian, I'll leap in because you know, I've got one I prepared earlier for that because I have been asked. I think if you talk to, and I think it was Jess raised it earlier, and you're right. Often, if you meet a lawyer at a barbecue and say, "What do you do?" they'll tell you they're a lawyer. But if you look at the law profession, not all lawyers do all things, and the lawyer you meet at the barbecue might be better served to work with you on selling your house than resolving your marital dispute. So it is completely within the bounds of professionalism to have extreme diversity, and the bits, the exciting and generative bits are the bits that we have in common, and there are commonalities that we can draw on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the idea of lawyers being officers of the court, whether they're doing defamation or divorce, and it's the same with regulators by analogy. One of the things that has been touched on in the chat conversation and also with us, but I just want to zero in it a bit more, is it's almost self-evident in some ways, but what does the existence of a formed regulatory profession mean for regulatory capability, particularly in terms of public perception coming in of that group? And that's for anyone.
Well,
that's for you members of the audience too.
Not an easy question, Ian.
No.
But I think what we ideally achieve as a profession of regulation is, of course, first of all, that the public at large will take us more seriously, sort of, you know, sort of sees us as capable, qualified, trustworthy people, or a trustworthy group of people that we can deal with. And ideally, we can achieve that as a profession of regulation because, you know, we commit to a shared set of standards, and we commit to having a shared set of knowledge and keeping up our knowledge and providing roughly a similar type of service, irrespective of where we are working and who we are working with. So ideally, the whole process of engaging with regulators as somebody in the general public, ideally that process becomes more predictable. And if that is something we can achieve through professionalization, then hopefully we can also increase the trust in regulators at large. Yeah,
yeah, and it goes out to the public that way. I just look at Mike's comment on the chat. Not quite on the same point, but I can't resist it. Mike takes pride at barbecues to say that he's a health and safety inspector. He's not sure he'd want to introduce himself as a regulator. I want to go to barbecues with Mike because I know their sausages would be healthy as a result. But it is an interesting kind of identity point, isn't it? Are we public servants first or regulators? And is it sort of dichotomous like that? Can we be both? I would have thought we should be both, but some people would say, no, you can't. What do we think of that?
Well, I think we have to be both. There's a certain necessity in that, which perhaps makes it a difficult starting point. But I certainly think you can be both, despite that. You know, you have different obligations as a public servant, and depending on where you sit within the public service, whether you're out on the front line, you know, on the very front lines as a health and safety inspector, or whether you're a bit like, I guess, a bit more like me, or at the desk a bit more, and perhaps fostering relationships and ensuring my team has the right resources and the right skills to perform their jobs as regulators. You know, that depending on the day of the week, I'm first and foremost a regulator, and then I may then be a public servant on the next day as first and foremost. So it is a bit of a necessity to put on a hat and take off a hat and then put on a different hat. So yeah, it's pretty hard.
And it's Lisa, you were going to say.
Oh, I wanted to add, and it will sort of sound glib, but those of you on the call who've been around the public sector for a long time will know that there are a lot of people who call themselves a policy person. So we have in the public sector, I'm a policy person, or, you know, I'll talk to someone and say, oh, I'm looking for someone to do this role. Do you think so-and-so could do it? Oh, no, they're a policy person. And it's become its own established piece. And look, as a very much a sidebar to this, but I think an important one, it's really important that within the public sector, other people get to say, oh yes, well, I'm a regulator, you know, yeah, that I have a distinct role and function as well. And as we move through into the ways that the public sector is trying to operate and to really take a systemic view of the outcomes we're seeking and the roles that we have, it's kind of probably important within the public sector that we understand that it takes a range of roles and professions to bring about those outcomes.
And it also anchors back, I think, to the professional pride and identity point that Jess opened this thread with as well, right back earlier. Members of the audience, I can see that we've done it differently this month. And rather than using a traditional Q&A format, you've had a parallel conversation to which you've implicitly invited us. And if I may say so, I like it. I do look at Jacqueline's come back to me, not sure about the sausage point, Ian, not sure about healthy, but at least if you go with our colleague, they'd at least meet New Zealand food standards. And I guess a serious point that we extrapolate from that is the function of the regulator to at least mitigate regulatory failure and obviously promote regulatory excellence. How much is regulatory capability and the identity of a regulatory profession that underscores it? How much of a mitigant is that potentially against regulatory failure in a macro sense? And I'll leave that to any of the panel to tackle that one. We touched on regulatory failure a couple of episodes back as well.
I can't answer that, Ian, but I can say that as we've worked with the evaluation team on the evaluation of GREG, we've asked, you know, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And if you go back to the Productivity Commission report, there is, and it's a long bow of steps. And I guess I kind of, if you want to take a regulatory view of it, a Swiss cheese element to it. I'm not sure that we would want to say that if we have a regulatory profession, we won't have regulatory failure.
Of course.
Regulatory failures occur for a number of reasons, and often because of that Swiss cheese effect of holes lining up. What we can do is work really hard to make sure that we've got a capable profession. And, you know, and I would dare say too, that what we really want is a profession that learns from regulatory failure. So you've got a group of people who, when there is a failure, are looking really hard at it and trying to understand it and take whatever can be learned from it into the ongoing work, rather than saying that we're here to eliminate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Lisa. And I think as we come to the top of the hour and close, I think we've got some evidence from what you said and from what we've said of a professionalized workforce by a margin. But I guess, is it enough? And what next? I'm going to leave you with our panel's final thoughts on that. Jess, to you first.
Sure, and I think just very quickly, just to add to Lisa's point, of course, a regulatory profession won't prevent regulatory failure, but I think when we look at instances of regulatory failure in New Zealand, they often have systemic causes, and a lot of regulatory agencies struggle to have the required influence on government and in the system. And, you know, it's an oversimplification, but I think there is strength in numbers. And I think that it would help us as regulators and the influence that's required in establishing that profession. I think that we're heading in the right direction, and the fact that we're even having this discussion indicates that there is value. But like all vocations, it does take a long time to build. So I'd suggest that we're on a journey, but we're not at the destination.
Gotcha. Thank you, Jess. And Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just repeat what I said at the start, which is I think the profession's been emergent and that we're actually at pretty much a critical juncture of taking not so much a step, but a leap into more professionalism. So, you know, I'm quite excited about the role that GREG might play in the future of that evolving profession.
Thanks, Lisa. Final link from you, Simon.
Oh, yeah, I agree, obviously, with what Jess and Lisa have both said. I think you know, huge steps have been made to professionalising the regulated community within New Zealand, and we do have some way to go, but we're definitely on the right track. I think the benefits of having a profession far outweigh the negatives. I think there's huge value in it, and like you say, the fact that we're here discussing it is a good sign that we're heading in the right direction.
Thank you, Simon. And Jeroen, last but not least, briefly from yourself.
Thank you, Ian. Well, look, all of the above. Yes, we are definitely sort of moving in the right direction, and we have gone. We've achieved a lot over the last 5, 10, 15 years, and that's also something that we have to recognize. So no, we're not there yet, but we're definitely moving in the right direction. And I think sort of an important thing is that we become more aware of a shared ownership of good regulatory outcomes, and having a good regulatory profession might help us with that. So I'm going to leave it with that, but thank you.
Nice place to leave it. Thank you, Jess, Lisa, Simon, and Jeroen. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, members of the audience, to yourself. We're back in just less than a month, at a slightly earlier date, on the 21st of October, talking about international regulation. More on that. Keep an ai out on the usual channels. I close, as I always do, with MB's closing karakia. I do so now. Ka hiki te tapu kia watia, ai te ara. Kia taruki ai, te o marama, hui e, taiki e. Until next time, from all of us here, stay safe, stay well, and ka kite anō.